Welcome, everybody, to the March 12th, 2026 AI update for the AIX Higher Ed podcast. And this week, we're going to be talking a little bit about some specific items, including Techlash, autonomous AI, power consolidation that's happening in real time for how civilization is being reshaped. AI is starting to build itself. We're getting into some self-recursive development. And the question, as Stefan poses it, are we ready? I'm not really sure. What's really challenging about this time is that it's not just the technology, but the rate of change and how fast it's accelerating that it's difficult to even keep up with. And I think that's probably the reason why there's not as much of a backlash or response as you might otherwise see, because there's just so much happening at once. It's hard to even keep up.
Yeah, and I think one thing is, that if you look at the big picture, there's a lot of kind of techlash happening, right? So people aren't doing a lot about it, but, as we'll see, there's tons of articles that say like majority of Americans oppose AI. There's crackdowns on kind of phones in schools and even devices, right? Like Jonathan Haidt now basically blaming every problem on education, every problem in education, on these devices and, computers, right? That kids are just using in school. So there's kind of this enormous techlash going on, but that's not slowing down the progress of AI development at all. And, part of it's for the reason you mentioned, right? Like there's plenty of investment in the area. There's obviously people leading the area, but we're also, and we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit in the podcast, just how AI is building itself. But also we're starting to see AI essentially deploy itself, at least beyond the initial level triggered by the human. So it's not clear in how much we're going to need humans to support the deployment of the AI. So as long as some people can get, they have enough power to basically kind of make the AI happen, there's a lot of stuff that can happen after that. And that we're not really dependent on people for anymore, right? Every other technological deployment was completely dependent on people. This one is not entirely dependent on people. So we kind of have these kind of, this situation in society where I think you're kind of dividing into almost two worlds, right? Where there's this world that they're imagining they're slowing down AI and technological advancement. But then there's just kind of this enormous amount of technological advancement and even deployment that's happening irrespective of really what a lot of people think about it.
The other interesting aspect of this, and this is something I want to draw from a guest speaker that we had on my campus earlier this week, Sean O'Brien, who was a guest on this podcast just a couple of months ago. He was talking a bit about how what's really shocking about what's happening and what's really difficult to handle is not the AI technology itself as much as the acceleration. And he was really leaning into the discussion about the role for humans and to consider what the role is for humans and how we prepare those durable skills that we've talked quite a bit about and how that gets worked through. But there's this interesting split, as Stefan is talking about, that it's not just about the development of the technology, but when it gets to the point of self-development and self-deployment, and you detach the technology from humans, that acceleration, of course, grows. And then we also have a different context that it's going to be really difficult for us to understand how to manage. And I think that's probably driving a lot of the techlash that we're seeing now, even as we just get glimmers of what that's going to be and how it's developing.
And, like I said, we see different manifestations of it. I believe these are pretty new websites. There's a pro-human AI declaration that's out. There's this article that says that 50% of Americans oppose AI. There's obviously opposition, to data centers. We're seeing more device bans in schools, and schools are still debating like chatbots. I was on a conference call, so to speak, a meeting earlier today, and there was a person from Pennsylvania in the new intermediate unit, and he was saying a lot of the schools not even talking about AI yet. That's not direct opposition, but that's kind of like, well, there's not a lot of uptake. So we're kind of starting to see it, at least in minds, a little bit in practice. I don't think there's actual, in schools, we're seeing kind of like some restrictions on the technology. We're clearly not seeing that in industry. You're clearly not seeing that at the top of the tech stack, And, I've seen it, obviously, most of this is, happening in K-12, but I've seen a little bit in university where you have some faculty trying to argue off. I saw somebody post in a group, a writing professor saying, I told the students no AI writing, zero. Like, you can't use Grammarly. I think she even said you can't use spell check. She's like, I want to see all your errors, right? That's kind of a little bit extreme, but we definitely see this Techlash in education, which is kind of its own protected space, right? Kind of based on the rationale that I guess the students will think more and somehow become more prepared for the AI world. Which I think everybody's acting in good faith in what they think is in the best interest of students, but it's definitely happening.
I think part of the problem is that because of the acceleration or the rate of change that we're seeing, when we think about educators, thinking about that example of a faculty member saying they didn't want even spell check to be used. They want to see the errors. There's a role for that. And certainly in learning how to write and development of writing skills, we want students to be able to make those mistakes, not have the guardrails and support of AI until they learn how to develop some of those skills themselves. Part of the problem, though, is that we're moving to from one context, one framework, one perspective about writing to another. So we're seeing some really radical reactions to it. And that makes it really difficult. At the same time, we're also seeing radical differences between schools and school districts. Mentioning that there's some school districts talking about many of them still banning the use of AI or allowing access to AI. And then other schools, and some that I'm working with, that are talking about incorporating AI literacy, even it's in the 9th grade, and starting to integrate it a little bit earlier, and then figuring out how to turn on the tools that they want to make sure the students have access to and that teach them how to use appropriately. And even there, they're being cautious about it. But think about the different experiences for students at those two different school districts, both of them public school districts, not far from one another, but they're having radically different experiences. And then that ripple effect of what happens once they get to college is an even bigger issue, because then we aren't really sure how to meet the students where they are. If some are coming in with really advanced skills and understanding about how to use it appropriately, and others really have just been barred from using it and maybe followed those restrictions. And how do we get them caught up to speed? The other thing about the AI Techlash that I've been thinking a lot about is that some of this, and I think Brian Alexander talked about this on the podcast that we had with him, the interview we had with him, and it's really the poly crisis. There's so much going on and a lot of other causes of crisis and types of crisis. So device bans in school, that was happening before we were even thinking about AI. There was a discussion about banning devices just because of social media and distraction. When we're thinking about what's happening militarily, when we're thinking about the economy, and we're thinking about the social justice issues, there are a lot of issues that are coming to a head, and then they start to spill over. And it's very difficult to compartmentalize them. No one is compartmentalizing. None of us are really capable of that. So they get commingled. And I think that's certainly feeding into the techlash. We're going to see a lot more of it, because at the same time that those crises then commingle in our minds, the use of AI technology is being used in so many sectors of society that it's getting commingled, and it's inextricably becoming intertwined with all aspects of our society that techlash is just going to build. And we're going to face a reckoning. It's hard to know exactly how we're going to be able to navigate that and what we're going to be able to do with it. And it's an open bet. And maybe this is something we'll be looking at Polymarket or Call-Sheet about how people will react to this and what it's going to mean. But I think it's going to be increasingly an issue for any political campaign and any candidate, but also how people are going to fall under political lines and ideological lines, and what's that going to mean for use later. It's really going to be complicated.
And, here we can see, we talked about recursive self-improvement before, right? Which the idea that the AI can hypothesize, some problem, right? Some limitation of the current system, right? They hypothesize that, they come up with a solution. They test the solution, right? And then, they evaluate the solution, and, they can do that iteratively multiple times, right? To make kind of minor improvements or, grand improvements, and then they can deploy it. And Andrej Karpathy, he's pretty famous. We've talked about him before. He was in charge of full self-driving at Tesla. He was one of the co-founders of OpenAI. He just kind of has the time and resources to do his own thing. But he basically just kind of started automating essentially the development of language models, right? And he created the AI created an hypothesis, ran the experimentation, and kind of integrated it all without human intervention. And the picture shows somebody sleeping because he kind of just set it to do this, and he went to sleep. And he woke up, and the agents did their work, and there were a lot of improvements. And he said a lot of the improvements, he's been working on these models originally, even back to GPT-2, for his career. And he's like, it found a lot of like problems, and came up with solutions that me working on this, all this time, like I didn't see, right? So we're starting to see, and this is kind of a small example, but the small examples lead to large examples over time. And everybody's kind of starting to talk about, Anthropic today mentioned, oh, well, it's starting to happen so fast because there's compounding improvements, right? Right. So the AI is now kind of building the AI. So here we see, obviously, this is still human directed from the top, right? It's kind of like pushing in a direction. All right. But then it's always going to be, you could always have like a higher level direction. This could be like a subset of, some other project, right? But the technology is just it's advancing, and it's not that it doesn't depend on us at all, but it certainly doesn't depend on needing that many people. It doesn't need all societal support to have recursive self.
What's also really interesting about the way that Andrej Karpathy was talking about this and experimenting with it, and you see this as Stefan's put on the slide, 8 years of human research compressed to hours. Being able to look back over the work and the developments that have been occurring over the last 8 or 10 years, and then seeing how his auto research script is able to really independently rediscover many of those milestones. It demonstrates a couple of things. First of all, we can verify whether or not that work is actually good because we already did the work, and you can see whether or not the agent's work is able to match the work that was done by humans over that period of time. But this also helps illustrate what sounded like sci-fi, that we could get 100 years of developments in the next 10 years because it's compressed like that. This gives you a glimmer of what that really looks like. That if you're allowed to run through this kind of auto research, an iterative process with agents, that they're going to be able to radically increase the speed with which we're able to do the work. And it's really important to underscore, it's not that they're skipping steps or that they're just getting somewhere faster. They're doing it. It's just that they're operating so much more quickly that they're able to compress a lot of that work into a short period of time. And that's something that's really hard for us to fathom. But there's a lot of potential there. Now, then we get into more of a discussion about OpenClaw and autonomous organizations. And this is something that was really drawn from a recent episode and thinking about how this is built out. But you can see maybe you have a human operator who's able to set some goals. And maybe the way that Stefan was talking about Andrej Karpathy with auto research, you have some human that's driving it from the beginning. But then you can have different agents that are operating in different roles. So you have Henry, the chief of staff, who's running Claude 4.6, Opus 4.6, and this agent will interpret goals and start delegating and managing. And that's something we've talked a bit about before, is the way that management skills are going to be really important, and not just for humans, but also for agents to be able to manage that. Then you might have the QA manager, who's Ralph, running ChatGPT, reviewing output every 10 minutes. And what was really interesting is to hear how this was being done, because if you just had ChatGPT running the whole time, it was really expensive. But if you had a local model running and doing the coding, and then ChatGPT brought in just to verify the output every 10 minutes, it was far cheaper and it was as fast. And you had another quality assurance mechanism there. So then you have these sub agents running locally, being able to do the coding, the research, and the writing. And when you have this, you have a fully closed loop. You have agents that are discovering problems. They can start evaluating the market opportunities, building software to meet those needs, and they're able to then deploy it on themselves. And so you even get beyond the point of the human operator. The human operator can set this in motion, but then eventually you get to the point where it can work through this fully closed loop and start developing faster and faster and developing further. And just think about what this means when you have new models, and when the price comes down, how much more is going to be capable as we start thinking about this. And this is the split between people that are able to make use of these tools and work that efficiently and that productively in that period of time. And, there are potentially some real costs. And if it's not done well, it could be a real waste of resources. But if done well, think about how that person running that mechanism and that model is going to be able to really pull ahead from somebody else. And this is where, at the very least, even if somebody is really finds this challenging and they don't really like the direction it's going, they're going to have to recognize that there's a market incentive for any company to start employing mechanisms like this, models like this, so that they can keep up or hopefully get ahead in the market. And other companies are going to have to start deploying it just to be able to keep up. Otherwise, they're going to be priced out of the market very, very quickly.
Yeah, and it kind of like makes the resistance irrelevant, right? So say this company, right, was interested in hiring you as well to support them in some way, and you're like, well, I won't use AI. Okay, well, we don't really need too many people to work here who know how to use AI. Most of the work is just done by the AIs themselves. So it kind of makes the resistance to concretize kind of what I was saying broadly, theoretically earlier, right? Like it was kind of hard. Like, well, wait, there's this kind of AI society and there's this other society. It's like, okay, Well, you could choose not to use the AI, but some companies probably not going to want to hire you. They don't need to hire that many people, right? So they don't need to bend. You're not going to be able to compete. Your company that has, say this company, say they don't, right? But say they had 3 human employees, right? What are you going to do? Have 10, 15? How are you going to compete economically with them? It doesn't make any sense. You'd have to charge so much more, and it would take you a lot longer to finish the work. So you're not going to be economically competitive, right? And you're not going to be hireable. So the resistance, while I kind of understand it at a conceptual level, it's breaking. You're breaking yourself, right?
Now, I think part of what we're seeing with this, when you get to a fully autonomous organizational model, is one that it's the pendulum swinging the other way. And there is a place for it, and there's certain productivity elements that are beneficial. But I think what we're going to eventually see is the development of something that's more sophisticated. And Nate B. Jones, who was a podcaster that I follow and we've referenced before, had a recent podcast talking a bit about this in terms of considering management theory, where, deploying these tools effectively means that an individual worker can really, radically multiply their productivity. That's not just enough, because you end up in an echo chamber in some cases, still having a team of 4 or 5 humans that are able to deploy these agents and these managers, or maybe 1 or 2 humans with these agents that are able to then check against each other, offer this pluralistic model of differing opinions and perspectives, is going to produce better work. It's not, again, about just doing the more work. It's about doing better work. And I think we're going to end up developing that into a more sophisticated way that will have a role for humans, but it's going to be very different than it is now. And that's part of what you saw in early WEF, World Economic Forum report about how these jobs are being transformed. We're starting to get a better sense of what that is going to look like.
And then, we also, of course, have, to push my theme a little bit farther, communities without people, right? We talked about Moltbook before, which is just kind of this place where all the autonomous agents go hang out. Some people don't let their agents hang out there, even people who, have a lot of, computer science, so to speak, knowledge. You really kind of understand these systems, like they think they're not safe. But Moltbook is a place where the agents can go hang out, form their own communities. They are building security into this, like, agent identification, agent identity verification and, organizational trust, like between the organizations, and how are we going to kind of modify and allow like safe transactions. And I think this will be changed or improved because Meta, Facebook, they bought Moltbook. Now, a lot of people say there wasn't really much to buy, that they could have kind of recreated this themselves. It's not really all that complicated, but, they got the name, and I think the people who created it are going to work there. But look, and Meta's, Facebook, Instagram, these are all social communities, right? So now we're going to have levels of, it's going to blur, right? Like we have these communities where there's kind of just the agents. And then we have our humans, and, there's already bots obviously posting on even pre-ChatGPT, so to speak, social media, but it can be a lot of just kind of dynamic interactions between individuals and bots, and you're not even going to know their bots, right? So kind of have all these virtual / human communities.
And this platform play is important to point out. OpenAI, as we've said before, has brought in the developer of OpenClaw, Meta now acquiring the identity layer of Moltbook. This is where we're going to find probably better security, and it's going to be better run, but it's also going to increase and expand the capabilities and the reach, and there'll be a lot more people that'll be involved, because it'll be a little bit easier, a little bit safer, and certainly cheaper than trying to set it up on their own servers. This is where it's really going to start to speed up, I think.
And, all of this, of course, pushes into the things I'm always talking about, because I say it's a good benchmark. Kind of AGI, right? Like human level intelligence. And we've seen something in the last couple of days, March 10th, by Demis Hassabis, talking really about science, but saying, I think he said on the horizon or over the horizon, we're pretty close, to getting AGI, and we're going to have all these kind of radical scientific advances. And then, then today, March 11th, this is coming out on the 12th, but today, March 11th, Anthropic released something that said, hey, we're close. We're within a couple of years of what Dario says is powerful AI, which is kind of basically AGI is kind of leaving it a little bit vague. And they're forming this, institute to study the impact of AI, partially because they get caught up in the Iran war debate. which we'll talk about, right? But you have the two companies with probably the two most sophisticated models, and OpenAI is obviously still hanging around there, as well, saying we're getting pretty close to AGI. So, and we really need to I think people keep saying, really need to start thinking about like what this is going to look like for society. The one thing I was kind of, in Anthropic's document, I just keyword search the word education, didn't appear anywhere. Right. So they're talking about how this is going to impact the economy, but they're talking about education, and education, at least of humans, at least traditionally been an important part of the economy. Right. So we should think about that. But, the other thing, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, is, okay, so that was kind of path one. They call it top down, like, oh, we're trying to kind of emulate like the human brain, right? That was kind of the idea kind of deep learning. We're kind of emulating that to a degree. But, then we had this new approach that came out, we'll talk on the next slide. Well, what if we just take a brain and kind of put it put it on silicon, right? Then can we just kind of copy the human brain? What does that mean, right? Will that lead to consciousness? And if you flip over to the next slide, so there's this company, Eon Systems, which is co-founded by Alex Winsner Gross, on the Moonshots podcast. He's, very, some people say he hypes the AI, but and a lot of times he ends up being accurate. But he co-founded this company, right, where they kind of emulate the brain of a virtual on a fruit fly, brain emulation to a virtual body. And it basically worked, right? So then the thing is, okay, well, can we scale this? Can we scale this to a mouse brain? Can we scale a cat brain? Or we get a human brain? It can kind of live in the silicon and or be emulated in the silicon. So it's just kind of another approach to development, which obviously kind of could get us to AGI faster or more thoroughly if we want exactly what the human brain is, rather than the way people have kind of tried to maybe reverse engineer it, if that's a right term. But it's this is probably really not getting enough play, maybe just because people are overwhelmed. But the idea that you could take a brain of a fly, of a fruit fly, and kind of emulate it in in silicon is pretty amazing.
Now, Stefan was talking a little bit about this and a couple of slides ago, talking about the Anthropic Institute and looking at some of these developments. And this references the documents that he was discussing. Demis Hassabis has, of course, from March 10th, from Games to Biology and Beyond, and talking about AlphaGo's impact and where they've gone since then. But we also encourage you to check that out, as well as the announcement from Anthropic on March 11th about the Anthropic Institute. And there's a lot that's going to be developed here. And as we see that, noticed from past several episodes, Anthropic keeps coming out with more about studying the impact of AI on society, on the economy, on different sectors of our culture and the world. And I think they're trying to be responsible, of course, in figuring out what this is going to look like. I think we're also seeing it speed up because they see that the development of the technology is speeding up at such a rate that they want to try and help us get ready for it. I don't know that it's happening, that we're developing that discussion fast enough. But it really is about having the conversations. We need to have these conversations. And everywhere that I go, from guest speaker on campus to a faculty meeting today where faculty were talking about they need to have conversations about what does this mean for education. They're all right. We need to have these conversations, but we're not having them fast enough, deep enough, or in a sophisticated enough level to consider where do we go, not just catching up, but where do we go for the next couple of years?
And, part of, like I said, the reason, Anthropic started this, right? It's like, well, we talked about this, the Department of War wants to use Anthropic's AI, both, in autonomous weapon systems, ones that would make their own decisions, not just to target, but to actually kill. Right. And then domestic surveillance. So of Americans. And, we're talking about mass surveillance, autonomous weapons, and it's a big deal. Who's going to control the future of this technology? And I say the future of this technology, because technology is here. It's already so incredibly powerful, like AGI or not. Like, I mean, just the idea that, well, we say, well, it's human level when it's as smart as every human on the planet. Combined. I mean, there have been no humans like that I know of, right? Like even, Demis Hassabis is a pretty smart guy, seems to know an awful lot about AI and medicine. You probably couldn't throw him into a courtroom. He probably wouldn't do that well, right? But the idea of like the AGI is that, he could also do that, right? He could also like fly the jet plane. maybe we're a little closer than we are, but how this powerful technology is going to be controlled is so important. And that's why I kind of actually worry about this schism beyond like a lot of people getting left out. They're not going to have any say at all or control over how this technology develops. And this technology is clearly going to be smarter than an individual person, right? Like in some ways it isn't, in some ways it already is, but they're going to kind of be just kind of left out of the future. And their kids are going to be left out of the future.
The idea of the mass surveillance issue, in particular between the Department of War and Anthropic, is a really good illustration of the split that we're seeing. Because the Department of War will say, well, we're not using it for mass surveillance. We're not trying to use it for mass surveillance. Current law wouldn't allow us to do that, and to deploy it in that way. But what they're not getting in Anthropic is, I think, and Dario Amodei has done a good job of explaining this, but I think most of us are having trouble grasping, is that it's not about developing new AI for surveillance. It's about using current AI to evaluate and mine all of the data that we already have. And that would allow a level of mass surveillance that no one who wrote current law had any idea of what it was capable of. It far exceeds what the intent of the law would have allowed for. And so they both are right on some level. The Department of War will say, or many people that are backing the Department of War will say, well, we already have current law protecting Americans to prevent new developments of surveillance techniques. And they're just not getting that the AI researchers are pointing out you don't need new surveillance techniques. You have technology now that can take all of the surveillance that's already there and be able to offer insights and understandings that we never would have had before, on a level that is really quite scary, and nobody really gets. And so it's clear for autonomous weapons, it just means turning that on. But what are the other areas where we're starting to consider policy, law, practice from an old perspective that doesn't take into account what AI is going to be able to do to that area? And mass surveillance is the example of this. We have to start thinking about, hey, take a step back and view what would the current technology allow us to do that it wasn't possible when we developed the laws or the policies or the practices, because that past intent is out of date. It just doesn't apply anymore. And we have to have a further conversation about not just what would be developed, but what's available now. And what the limitations are that need to be put into place there. The last thing that Stefan put on the slide that I think is really important at the bottom is that this is not just Anthropic's fight. There are many in the AI community that are backing this, because Anthropic is not taking Department of War to court to say, take us back as your vendor. They're taking them back to say, you shouldn't be able to then say we're a supply chain risk. And there are many other researchers from OpenAI and Google DeepMind that filed an amicus brief, and other leaders in the AI field saying that shouldn't be a decision made by the government. And this is something I think we'll explore in some further episodes. When you have a governmental decision that is going to start to make decisions about whether or not certain models can survive or be used, you lead to a monoculture that could be really dangerous. And that's something we'll need to explore a little further. Continue to follow the story, because this has a lot of ramifications, not just for what happens with what the Department of War federal agencies use for AI, but for how decisions will be made going forward about AI. And it could set a very dangerous precedent if it goes the wrong way.
And, this will just kind of conclude on, we've kind of been talking about it, throughout the podcast, right? But, just kind of the Techlash creates kind of a class divide, right? Those with resources, those with the know-how, right? Those with the ability once you have the know-how, then you can expand your own education in a ways that's relevant. And, those without resources are kind of get left behind. And I kind of some ways, one thing I see it's people take, in the education field, and they just take the educational status quo for granted, right? And they're like, well, AI disrupts this, therefore AI is bad. It's like, well, it wasn't perfect to begin with, right? The learning science that people like that term, behind the professor on the stage lectures is not really fabulous, right? But even then it was kind of built for a different era and a different need. And people don't understand that, like, it's that disruptive, right? Like that it's, yes, we ended up with we didn't have mass education in the agriculture era. Like we didn't need it, and it wouldn't have been useful, right? So like, is this model going to be useful when you kind of have agentic autonomous companies, right? And that's not to say that education isn't useful. Education will always be useful, but that the way we do it now is not necessarily at least optimal. And I don't really people understand, think these learning kind of content and practices like ahistoric, like we've reached the end of educational history. So that's kind of what concerns me. But I think we're seeing it more. The chatbot didn't really kind of expose it as much, right? There's just kind of a different way of interacting and a different way of learning. You could say, threaten the role of the teacher, but right. But this, when you just have agents that can kind of go out and kind of learn things, organize things, make decisions to kill. I mean, this is a whole other level of thinking about how we need to organize society, what values we want, rules of government. And like you were talking about the surveillance. Yeah, I mean, Dwarkesh Patel, like he had a blog today. And he was just saying, like, yeah, there's all this information that's collected, but nobody could afford to pay millions of people to go dig through it all, right? And even with, narrow AI and get assistance, but now you just have the AI look through all of it all at once. And he kind of estimated that right now it cost about $30 billion a year for the government to do that, which sounds like a lot of money. It's not a lot of money. I guess the first 6 days of the Iran war cost us $11 billion, right? Okay, so it's not even a lot, but he says in a few years it'll cost like $30 million. All right, so the government can just kind of go through and just kind of have, and go through all the coordinate everything, look through everything, synthesize it all, right? And he's like, this is what we really want. Like, he's like, we're trying to say we want to win the AI race, so China doesn't, because he's saying China, is authoritarian. He's like, well, we're going to do the same thing. So, there's just a lot of important conversations that need to happen.
The other point about this that I think I want to pick up from what Shauna Brown was saying on campus, on my campus the other day is, one aspect of this for education is that AI can be democratizing. It can provide opportunities for students. At the same time, people argue that AI can actually create, a scenario where students are losing access to education, or it can be used to, to hold people back or to prevent progress. Both of them can be true at the same time, and both of them are possibilities. What's distinctive about this is that within an educational context, we need to be really aware that what we're doing and what we don't do is an action here as well about how do we prepare our students to have those conversations and interact in that world. It's not even to say that all students should learn to use AI to the nth degree or employ it everywhere that they should. But if they aren't taught about AI, if they don't have AI literacy and fluency and learn how to use the tools appropriately and responsibly, they're going to be left behind. And the people that will have those skills, and there are some that are doing it, and as Stefan mentions on this slide, every month the school debates whether or not ChatGPT should be allowed. It's another month where the children of engineers or other people that are using these tools are learning how to build more and more advanced tools. That's just creating a greater gap. And so it's a decision as to whether or not we want AI to be democratizing, whether or not we want our students to be involved in those conversations and making decisions about what should be done with AI in the future, with the military and society and the economy and the rest of society. But the more we stick our head in the sand and say that we're just going to prohibit it and not have it in the classroom, it does our students a great disservice. And that's not to say that they need to learn how to use it everywhere, but they need to learn about it. They need to learn its applications. They need to understand responsible uses so that at the very least, they can speak intelligently about the limits and what they want to see happen within society. We can't let the techlash just be a knee-jerk reaction that is just an emotional reaction that could lead to something even worse, where we have a few people that really control. And this is what I was trying to get at with this discussion between Anthropic and the Department of War. The precedent can be set that if we just try to say we ban it from certain areas of society, it's not going to go away. It just means a handful of people will control it. And there are a lot more dangerous things that can happen with it if it's only handled by a few and the rest of us are left out of the conversation about how to manage it.
So yeah, we just need a bigger conversation. We're trying, we try to get every week, we try to get the conversation going. And it can start small. I was talking to a middle schooler today, 7th grader, I think. He didn't know, he had never heard the term deepfakes. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know that you could just make up an image that wasn't real. And I showed him a couple images and he thought they were real. He was stunned, right? And so it's like, okay, do we need him to, is he really going to, get involved in the conversation about, autonomous weapons? We might learn about it in debate or something, but that's kind of not the essential thing. He needs to know what a deepfake is. So, he doesn't get kind of scammed or upset or, manipulated, right? And that's not an age where it's too young to, every middle school student should understand like deepfakes, because some of the stuff that's going on in schools, really problematic, right? So there's all kind of different ways to start the conversation at all kind of different levels.
All right. Well, thank you, Stefan. We'll be back again next week with another update, as well as an interview coming up in a few days. And we look forward to sharing that with you soon. Thanks. See you soon.